The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
In a country fortunate enough to have access to more than 20% of the world's fresh water, it seems obvious that everyone should have enough. So why did the federal government last week admit that it would be unable to meet its promise to end all the boil water advisories that have long plagued Indigenous communities? We're looking into that tonight. First up, though, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, who's retiring from the Senate next month. He joins us to reflect on a distinguished career, what progress he's seen, and what he still hopes for. It's Monday, December 7th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. When he was named Mijanagijik, which is Ojibwe for the one who speaks of pictures in the sky, the path ahead for Senator Murray Sinclair was still to be forged. And yet, it aptly presages his impressive legal career, including 2 decades on the bench, and, as he is perhaps best known, in his work as chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. 5 years ago, he was appointed to the so-called Red Chamber for Manitoba as an independent senator. He recently announced that he would retire from that appointment in January, and he joins us now from Winnipeg, Manitoba for some parting reflections. Senator Sinclair, it's always a joy to have you on our program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Stephen. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. You are, I guess we should start with this, you are more than 5 years away from the mandatory retirement age of 75 for a senator, and, you know, there's precious few of them who leave early. So how come you are?
Well, it's time. For me, we all make these decisions based upon our individual factors and whatever is important to us at the time. And I had no difficulty really making this decision. In fact, when I was appointed to the Senate in 2016, just after the TRC, at that time when the TRC ended, I already made a commitment to my family and to the public that I was stepping back from public life. But I was persuaded by the Prime Minister and others to accept a position in the Senate. And I said, both to myself and to others, I'm going to do this for 5 years, and then I'm going to consider my situation at that time. So after 5 years, we're approaching that in the springtime. I thought it's probably time, because the pandemic has kind of sped things up for us, and also there are other factors that have gone into consideration.
Do you want to amplify on that at all?
Well, the workload is very heavy for me. I not only, of course, have my Senate duties, but I also have public speaking demands that are imposed upon me, or asked of me, and I gladly do them. In addition to that, as you may know, I've undertaken to write a memoir, and that's very time-consuming. And I always wanted to go back to mentor young law students, particularly young Indigenous law students, about what it's like and what it means to be an Indigenous lawyer in this day and age, so that they can be proper role models for those who are following behind them. And so all of that are all important objectives for me. And I thought the latter ones were becoming more and more significant. In addition to that, of course, there's also my family's demands and expectations as well. And with the pandemic, I've spent more time with my family, with my children, my wife, and her medical needs are also quite...
On this program, and we talked about what your expectations were for the Senate. And let's play a little snippet from that conversation, and then we'll come back and chat again.
I have seen the Senate function at a time in my life when it was truly a respectable and an institution which was important to us. And I've seen the important work that it's done over the years. And I've always considered the Senate to be like a council of elders, that it needs to be armed with wisdom. It needs to be unafraid to use that wisdom, and to use that wisdom to stand up for the people to ensure that the government, which is elected to govern, can govern and is allowed to govern, but that it, in doing so, does not lose sight of its responsibility to the people.
All right, let's find out how all that went. Did the Senate live up to its responsibility, in your view?
Well, I think we're getting there. I don't think we're there yet. I think that we have a ways to go, but at the same time, that philosophy sparked a lot of interest on the part of people wanting to become senators. And I've been told many times that my comments in that regard in my first speech in the Senate was about that very topic and the role of senators. And it has, I'm told, inspired others to apply to become senators. There is a different attitude on the part of the independent senators, particularly, about looking outside of the political spectrum when it comes to responsibilities and what it is that we need to think about and take care of, and putting aside as well personal agendas and thinking of the overall best interests of the country. And I think that tenor is beginning to take hold. I think there are probably rule changes and maybe some legislative changes that need to be put into place in order to free up senators to be able to do that. But we've had the conversations a number of times, and I really expect that trend is going to continue. I'm happy with the progress that we've made in this short time that I've been able to be there. I think that there is more progress that needs to be made, but at the same time, the conversation within the Senate is much different than it used to be.
Okay, a couple things to follow up on there. You mentioned progress. What would you point to as evidence that progress has happened?
Well, we have a large group now of independent senators who do not toe a party line, do not belong to or owe anything to the Liberal Party, to the New Democrats, to the Conservatives, or to the Bloc, who are the major political parties in Canada, and the Green Party as well. But we do take guidance from the same philosophies that spur them to do what they do. So there are people within the independent senators group who have a conservative view when it comes to fiscal policy. When it comes to environmental issues, we have a very strong cadre of senators who believe strongly in the environment. But at the same time, they recognize the importance of allowing the government to govern because they are the elected body. But at the moment, we're sort of bound up in the rules that limit the role of independent senators. So those will need to be changed in order for us to be more effective.
There are, of course, at least two competing views of how the Senate should operate. One is the one you just articulated, which is a kind of a council of elders, nonpartisan, providing sober second thought, as has been its custom for more than 150 years. The other view is that it should be a partisan chamber and in some respects, an extension of the House of Commons, a means by which the government of the day either does or doesn't get its program through. We know that you agree with Prime Minister Trudeau that it ought to be more of the former than the latter. Do you think, though, that we are in a moment of history where the corner has been turned and we can't go back to the way it was? It's now going to be this way going forward.
Yes, I do believe that. I think that those who would try to change it back to the way that it was are going to face the fact that many of the senators who've been appointed in the last 5 years since I was there are going to be there for quite a long period of time, and they are going to be focusing upon that particular aspect of the agenda within the Senate. Senate reform is a significant issue for debate among senators, and I think that we will not see the end of that debate for a considerable period. And I think that the diminishing role of political parties within the Senate, I think, is an important step because it has been my view from the outset, and it's becoming the view of many others, that the political parties have their role to play in the House of Commons. That they're the elected representatives who have chosen to be elected under the banner of one or the other of the political parties will exercise those political partisan views in that way, and then they will present us the results of that debate and vote. But then it's for us to look beyond the partisanship and to look at whether or not this meets the constitutional rights of individuals, Canadians, also whether it meets the needs of the country in a way that keeps us functioning in a proper nationhood state.
I'd like to get your take on the very strange year in which we live. 2020 has, it's been a triple threat in some respects, not only COVID-19, but of course the economic dislocation for many that has come with it. And beyond that, the kind of racial reckoning that has taken place across North America for so-called BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I know some people have been mortified at what they have seen when they have seen demonstrations in the streets, and other people have been quite encouraged by it all. How do you regard it?
Well, I think it's an important conversation for us to have, and the demonstrations and the protests that we see are really a reflection of the undercurrent of racism that is at play within many of our institutions and systems. People who are protesting against police action, for example, are not doing it because they dislike police. They're doing it because they dislike the way that police are policing. And the same is true with our other institutions in society as well. We see protests against political decision-making activities. We see protests against politicians, and it is because of the things that they say and what they stand for and their unconscious racism and bias that they need to be held to account, and they are being held to account. So I think that we're not through with that conversation yet. I think there are some systemic and institutional changes that still need to occur. But I think generally the direction in which our society is going is going to be a good direction, because we are now engaged in a dialogue about things like cultural genocide, historical genocide, systemic racism, systemic bias, systemic discrimination. When we weren't in discussion about those things before, to the extent that often we didn't understand what it was that we were talking about when those terms were being used.
You actually got us on the road to that conversation several years ago with your 94 calls to action when you chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How far down the road of seeing those 94 calls to action actually implemented do you think we are today?
Well, there are some significant changes that have occurred within the educational system that I think are very good. We have seen attempts on the part of curriculum program teams to change the curriculum so that it properly reflects the true history of this country, but does it in a contextual way so that people understand why things were being done at that particular point in time, and that it isn't solely just a bad thing only because it was a bad thing. There are reasons why bad things happen, and it's only when we understand why those reasons influence that direction that we will be able to prevent them from occurring again. And that's what's important. And we are learning that. We are learning about that. But we still have a ways to go. Our educational systems have not all embraced curriculum change. And we have seen, in fact, that there have been various provinces and places within Canada that have pushed against making curriculum changes. They like the way the story has been told in the past, and the way the story will continue to be told. But we're seeing changes in the media. The degree to which stories are covered now in the media, and the language that the media uses, I think is much different than it was before. I've been invited to speak at church congregation meetings that want to talk about how churches can change the way that they do business and how they can converse about this. And I think that's a significant improvement. I've been invited to corporate events to speak to corporations about how they can go about doing their business internally within their operations, but also how they can partner with Indigenous communities better than they have in the past.
One aspect of this racial reckoning that has been particularly controversial is what we do about the so-called old white men who founded this country 150 plus years ago. We have seen in Montreal, Johnny MacDonald's statue being toppled and the head falling off. We have seen in Kingston, his hometown, Queen's University take his name off the law school there. You are one of the few Indigenous leaders, if I can put it this way, who has said, we actually don't have to eliminate Sir John A.'s name from our country, but we don't have to topple the statues. We don't have to have status quo either. You've wanted to look for a third way. Could you tell us if you think that third way is still available to this country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is quite available to us. And in fact, from the perspective of reconciliation, I think it's probably the more comfortable way to go. Having said that, let me be clear that there are elements within our historical system. There are books within our histories that have extolled the virtues of people like Sir John A. Macdonald, and he's not the only one, who deliberately set out to do wrong to people of color. And we have ignored that fact historically to the extent that we don't even realize now that he did and said those kinds of things. We don't know, for example, and we're not taught that Sir John A. Macdonald was one of the first people in Canada to use the term Aryan race, that he believed that people of Aryan race should be the only ones to come to Canada and immigrate here. And with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1940s, we came to see the viciousness by which that could become the rule of behavior in this country. And so we need to guard against that. We need to ensure that that kind of language is not part of our vernacular here in this country. But we also need to ensure that when our children are growing up, that they learn the full history of the country, that they know everybody who did everything. And what I've said in the past is that my preference would be that we tell the truthful story about these historical figures. We stop extolling them as simply virtuous people, that would put them into a proper context, and that we at the same time should have a parallel or similar system put in place for the historical figures of other races and other cultures as well.
I wonder if part of the progress that you think we are making includes the federal government introducing, as they did not too long ago, the bill implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the so-called UNDRIP.
Well, that's an important step. We called for that in the Truth and Reconciliation's call to action. And in the calls to action, we pointed out that as a means by which we can achieve reconciliation, it sets a very useful pathway for us to go, because within the United Nations Declaration, all of the aspects of how colonialism has negatively impacted all Canadians, not just people of color, not just Indigenous people, but all Canadians have been impacted by this history of colonialism. And one of the historical truths that I speak about, and I challenge people to debate it with me if they wish, is that our public school system since the 19th century has been teaching white supremacy. And we don't know it. We don't realize it. They only talk about the historical impact and historical benefits of having white people in this country. They never talk about the history of Indigenous people. They never talk about the true history of Black people and other people of color and what they brought to the discussion and dialogue as well, other than the occasional figure that are so prominent that you can't really ignore them. For the longest time, in the schools that I went to in the 60s and 70s, the main civil rights figures that we were talking about were people who were living at that time. But we didn't talk about the civil rights figures that preceded Martin Luther King and others like him, and we should have been.
I do recall, though, this past year, the head of the RCMP being asked whether she thought systemic racism existed in her police service, and she said no, and she then got a whole ton of bricks come piling down on her head. And I wonder whether you think that, I see you smiling a little bit there, I'm going to infer from that smile that you think that's progress.
Well, the fact that she was called out for it, I think, is an indication of the fact that we now have a better understanding of what that means. But I do want you to know, and others as well, that I've had conversations with the commissioner, and I understand sort of where she's coming from, in the sense that she's coming from a place that almost all Canadians are coming from, which is we have never been taught about what systemic racism is. We don't know how systemic racism works. We think systemic racism exists only where you can prove that every single person within a system, within an institution, is a racist. And in reality, systemic racism is not about intent. Systemic racism is about impact. And it's about the way that the system has an impact upon an identifiable group of people that you need to assess and you need to look at. So if you have a rule, for example, that says in order to be a police officer that everybody has to be 5'10" and over and weigh at least 180 pounds, well, you're eliminating almost all women. You're eliminating the vast majority of people from Asian country. And yet it's been proven that they're quite capable police officers, but that's how systemic discrimination works. And people just don't understand that. And she didn't understand that either. And she's struggling to find a way to come to terms with that. But in addition to that, there are people within the RCMP, within her management structure, who I think actively believe that it would not be good for the RCMP ever to admit that they have a racism problem. And that failure to admit is going to be at the heart of a lot of difficulties if they don't come to terms with it very quickly.
Having said that, do you think more people get it now?
Well, I think so. I think we're now having conversations that we never had even 2 or 3 years ago. The Black Lives Matter movement has raised the dialogue, not necessarily the level of agreement, but it's raised the dialogue around the impact that decisions have upon the lives of people of color in this country and in the United States. And the expression always is that in North America is a place where people of color fear going out at night, not because other people of color might harm them, but people who are not of color might harm them.
In our last couple of minutes here, I just want to read something that, I think you know this fella pretty well. His name is Murray Sinclair, and he wrote an op-ed piece in the Winnipeg Free Press last week, in which he wrote, "While he did different monumental work in his career, my lasting image of him standing up for our people, no matter the odds, has never left. From his time working in, frankly, racist institutions as a first, to starting new paths where our cultures and communities can forge our own paths, my father's journey has remained resoundingly consistent. His success, found via his commitment to words, stories, and peaceful, reasoned dialogue as a method for change, is his life achievement and will be his lasting legacy." When a father reads those words written by a son, how does he feel about that?
Well, it was tremendously emotional to read them. And my wife and I both had tears in our eyes when we read what he said, and then he published it before he showed it to us. So it's not like he sought our permission ahead of time, which he didn't have to do. But I thought it was very touching, and it just goes to show that one of the legacies that I think we all should strive for is to have children like that, who speak like that, not just about their parents, but about the role of parenting overall. And he's a good father to his daughter, and he will be a good uncle to his nephews and nieces. And others that I know of who are now growing up in this day and age have examples like perhaps mine, but others as well, to see what it means to be patient, to persevere against hatred and discrimination and actions that are not acceptable, to be courageous and to strive to be wise, and to learn how to apply all of that in a way that is not harmful to others.
Well, Senator Sinclair, I guess I'd finally just say get to work on those memoirs, because we look forward to having you back here to talk about those.
Yeah, well, every time I end up staying up half the night writing them, I keep reminding myself, this is important. I better get to bed so I can finish it in the morning.
It's good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. All good wishes going forward, and thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen.
That's Senator Murray Sinclair, independent senator for at least another month from the province of Manitoba. It was a signature promise in the Liberals' 2015 election campaign. But last week, the federal government admitted that it would not meet its deadline to lift all the boil water advisories in First Nations communities across Canada by the year 2021. One community here in Ontario has been without potable water for more than a quarter century. Joining us now for more, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Alvin Fiddler. He is the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation. And Willow Fiddler, staff reporter at the Globe and Mail. In Attawapiskat, Ontario, on the western coast of James Bay, writer, musician, and Indigenous advocate Adrian Sutherland. And in Wasaga Beach, on the south shore of Georgian Bay, there's Jen Atkinson. She's the Director of Operations at the non-governmental organization called Water First. And we're delighted to welcome all four of you to our program tonight. We'd just like to start perhaps by putting a map up that will just lay out the background for those who are not as familiar with this issue as clearly you four folks are. Here's a map of the long-term advisories, both lifted and current in Ontario. And for those who are listening on podcast and can't see the map, I'll just describe it in some detail. We have green dots where the boil water advisories have been lifted, and they are sprinkled all throughout the province, in all regions of the province. But there are still many pesky red dots where boil water advisories still remain. So let's do the numbers here. Between 2015 and 2020, 97 long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted. That's the good news. However, 59 remain in 41 communities. Since 2016, the Government of Canada has made more than $2 billion in commitments to First Nations to build and repair water and wastewater infrastructure. All First Nations communities have access to trained personnel to sample and test drinking water, which is being monitored regularly. And in spite of all of that, we should say that the feds have now admitted that they will miss their deadline of lifting all the drinking water advisories in First Nations communities across Canada by March 2021. That was the original deadline. The Minister of Indigenous Services is named Mark Miller, and here's his explanation. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
This has to be put into perspective. This was an ambitious deadline from the get-go. When we say that it was an Ottawa-imposed deadline, or it was a deadline we set, those communities weren't sounded to say what time was reasonable, nor was their planning done. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working in communities to lift those diligently, as you've seen. But the reality is, when you engage with those communities, you say to them, obviously they look at us and they say this needed to be fixed yesterday. It should never have happened in the first place.
And just a little update on the minister. We asked him to be part of this program today. His schedule would not permit, but his office has said he will be on this program in the days ahead. So that's good to know. Chief Fiddler, to you first on this. I would like your reaction to the fact that they're unable to make their commitment of March 2021. But one of the explanations that was also given is that the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps understandably, required several First Nations to close their borders, and therefore the access that federal officials wanted to have to First Nations communities in order to help effectuate this promise, well, obviously that fell apart because of COVID-19. Do you accept that explanation?
I think it's important to note that these boil water advisories have been in place for a long, long time, including Neskantaga, going on 26 years, including my own community of Musqueam Dam, going on 16 years. So this is a long-standing issue, and for the government to say that COVID is now the reason for these delays is unacceptable, knowing that they've had a long, long time to deal with these boil water advisories.
So COVID-19 may go some way to explaining why it's not happening, but not far enough. Do I read that right in your explanation?
Yeah, I mean, we've been at this now for a long time, including myself as Grand Chief of NAN. When I became, when I took this office 5 years ago, we made infrastructure a priority. We put a team together, and we've been at this now for at least 5 years. And for the government to now say that COVID will delay things is just for us and for people of Neskantaga and other communities that's not an acceptable reason.
Okay, Willow, let's get you in here next. You heard the Grand Chief refer to Neskantaga First Nation, which is well north of Lake Nipigon, up in northwestern Ontario. They've been under a boil water advisory for 25 years. It's the longest one in all of Canada. In the course of your reporting, you have spoken to residents there. Can you give us a sense about what life has been like for them with no potable water for a quarter of a century?
Well, when you speak to community members and ask how they're feeling, they'll tell you they're frustrated and that they're tired. And, you know, we've heard people say, and I've said before, that you have a whole generation of young people living in Neskantaga who've lived their entire lives without access to clean, safe drinking water. They don't know what it's like to go, you know, grab a glass and fill it up at the sink and drink it. That's just not possible for them. They don't know that, and it's just, yeah. So it's this ongoing frustration. Daily routines are impacted. You know, their daily lives are impacted when you have to, you know, you don't know whether the water is going to be on in the morning when you wake up, if you can flush the toilet. You know, your families and children are dragging and carrying sleds and wagons with pails and jugs to fill up the water at the community's reverse osmosis station, which sits in a shed above the lake, and even at times that isn't accessible. So it's been an ongoing years, decades of this frustration and not knowing. And people are tired. So the evacuees, and I'll just add, the evacuees have been here in Thunder Bay for over 40 days now. And that is extremely tiring for them. No one wants to be here. Everyone would much rather be at home. It's, you know, close to Christmas, and now people are wondering if they're going to make it home for Christmas.
Let me just do a quick follow-up with you, Willow. You mentioned evacuees who are now in Thunder Bay. Is that everybody from the First Nations Reserve there? Is everybody gone and moved to Thunder Bay?
When they first evacuated, there was a group of about 24 people that stayed behind to make sure that, you know, the infrastructure there in the community was being taken care of, that, you know, the pipes weren't freezing, because, of course, at that time, winter was just starting to settle in. So there was, you know, concern of household pipes freezing up, of course, when no one's there. So there was a group that stayed behind to make sure that all of those things are taken care of, feeding pets, for example, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. We should also say that you and the Grand Chief both have the same last name, and we suspect you are distantly related. Is that right?
We're both fiddlers. We're from different communities, and I was kind of joking around. We're all fiddlers are related somewhere along the line, and I imagine that's the case for us too.
Good, because I imagine that, you know, people watching and listening to this would be asking the question, so we just want to get that on the record. Adrian, let me get you in here right now. You're in Attawapiskat on the western shores of James Bay. When's the last time you took a drink from a tap in your community?
Never, actually. I've never been able to drink the water from the tap here.
How come?
Well, the water here has been contaminated ever since we've had running water. So since day one, our house was first tied in the late 90s, 1998, and the water quality has just been terrible. It's been really bad. Certainly can't drink it. It's also very hazardous to even bathe in it or breathe the vapors coming from the taps.
If you boil it, is it okay to cook with?
No, they're telling us not to cook with the food. They're telling us not to cook with the water. That's the instruction we had last year, and as far as I know, that still stands.
Now, do you have, I just want to get a better understanding of the state of the water right now, because I had heard that Attawapiskat is not under a boil water advisory. Is that the case?
That's correct. Now we're not under any boil water advisories. We do have dispensaries in the community that were replaced last year as a result of the water contamination. But from what I understand, the water still has the contaminants in it. I haven't heard anything as of last year about the water other than don't drink it, bathe, no greater than 2 minutes. Don't cook with it. Don't breathe the vapors coming from the taps. That's the last I've heard, and that's been over a year ago, and I haven't heard anything new since.
Okay, we're just going to clarify this. There's no boil water advisory, but there is a state of emergency declared related to your water, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There's some contaminants in the water, have been there for quite some time, and to my knowledge, those haven't been dealt with yet.
All right, you say you've never managed to take a drink of water out of the taps in Attawapiskat, in which case, what did you do for drinking water?
Oh well, for a long time as children, we grew up just collecting water from the local creeks, lakes, rivers mostly. We melted snow, ice, and collected water from a hole that we kept open all winter long that the community all collected their water from. So that we did that for many, many years. And in some cases today, there are still families doing that, including mine. We've collected water all last year and snow from the river. And just because we didn't feel safe drinking even the water dispensaries from the RO setup that we have.
RO setup? What does that stand for?
Sorry, the reverse osmosis, where we collect our drinking water.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks for that. Jen, let's get you in here now. Water First is the name of your organization. Tell us what you folks do.
Great. Water First is a Canadian charity that works in collaboration with Indigenous communities to address drinking water and water challenges. We work with our partners through training and education. And as partners, we're working to bring together young people into the field of drinking water and water science.
Adrian just told us that his water's been contaminated for as far back as he can remember. What kind of contamination do you typically see in water systems in the areas that you are surveying?
Well, there's a wide variety of different contaminants. There's chemicals, nitrates, phosphates. There could be heavy metals, lead, arsenic. And of course, we have bacteria. I'm sure you've heard of E. coli, viruses, protozoa such as Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And then in a treatment system, there can be contaminants as part of the actual treatment process if it's not looked after properly.
And how do all these chemicals get into the water system in the first place?
Some of them are naturally occurring. Some of them are a result of the environment, neighboring effects. We look at stormwater, we look at runoff, we look at the groundwater system, and some of them are there naturally, and some of them are part of how they enter our groundwater system.
Chief Fiddler, let me go back to you with this next question, and that is, why has this been such an unsolvable, intractable problem for so many decades?
Yeah, I think your question, I think, is part of the answer. It's a long-standing issue. There's a lot of history to this, going back to the creation of reserves. That a lot of our communities were put in places where it wasn't suitable to live in, and the water source was always questionable. So it's a long-standing issue, and it'll require a lot of work with government, working with First Nations in true partnership to create standards, for example, or to create regulations, or to create legislation that will lead to standards and building capacity at the community level for communities to be able to run their water treatment plants in a way that they were designed to.
Well, Willow, let's figure this out a little more deeply here, because it cannot be that, you would think anyway, that it wouldn't be that complicated to build a water treatment plant in every community that needed one. It ought not to take 25 years to do that. So what's been the holdup here?
Well, I think Alvin is right. I mean, the infrastructure in most of our First Nation communities just have been were non-existent to begin with, and substandard. So when you go back like 30, 40 years, when reserves were developing infrastructure, I think the solutions have always been substandard and never have taken into account things that like growing populations, for example, and then you run into problems that compound this. For example, housing. I mean, you could say the same thing with housing. The infrastructure just hasn't been there to it has been substandard, and yeah, I mean, so it's a pile of problems over decades that has led to this.
Okay, a pile of problems over decades. Adrian, to you next. Who do you, the fact that you haven't been able to take a drink of water out of your own tap for your entire life in Attawapiskat. Who do you blame for that?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, at this point, I guess if I had to blame someone, I might want to blame the feds, especially since they do have a judiciary responsibility to oversee the infrastructure needs of our communities. And it's disappointing to learn that they're not going to be meeting this commitment and the boil water advisories. And I would question whether or not this government has the ability to address the issues of water once and for all, ever. Why
do you say that?
Well, I mean, I've been here. I'm 44 years old. I'm almost middle-aged. I don't know if I ever will see our water issues addressed in my lifetime. Honestly, but you start to lose hope. After so long. Commitments, especially this big commitment that the government made, not being fulfilled. It's frustrating, you just kind of, what's the point of even talking about it anymore? That's how you feel as a resident here. It's very, very worrisome too. Your family is sort of not even having one of the most very basic human needs being met. And, and the attitudes, I think, towards some of these long-standing issues are just not quite serious enough.
How does that manifest itself? You say the attitudes don't seem serious enough. What evidence would you point to suggest that that's the case?
Well, I mean, for one, I think these issues are although there are many, many problems and they're compounded by more, I think they're very fixable. We need the resources. It's clear that what we need here in Attawapiskat, we need a new facility. Don't throw Band-Aid solutions at us because they don't work. That's what they've been doing for so many years. So we need a real solid plan. We need a new facility, a new water intake, a new water source. It's already been identified. So why can't we move forward now and find ways to make this happen? I just don't understand it.
Adrian, forgive the personal question here, but are you married? Do you have kids?
Yes, I do. I have 4 kids and 4 grandkids. So it's very worrisome for me knowing that the water coming from our tap. I mean, we got to bathe the little ones in this water too. So it's in and out. These are concerns. It's constantly on your mind. It's on your mind when you wake up, when you go to bed. So it's it's troublesome.
Jen Atkinson, who should we blame for the fact that things are the way they are?
Well, I think it's pretty hard for me to point blame where I'm sitting, but I can tell you that it's a very complicated situation. As Willow said earlier, this is in my opinion, it's a situation that's been neglected for a long time and it's allowed to grow. There's over 600, maybe 630 communities, I believe, in Canada, and there's no one-size solution that will fit all. There needs to be a holistic approach that includes consultation with a community, the proper location and design of a water treatment plant. And then once a treatment plant is in place, we need to be able to have skilled operators who can look after the plant and also have a long-term plan that includes succession. It's not just one challenge, it's quite a few going on here all at one time.
Well, let me pick up on that with Chief Fiddler, because I have heard that criticism numerous times in the past. It's not just a matter of building a new water treatment facility. You need local people who have the skills to be able to run it and, of course, fix it when it breaks down. Has that been a problem over the years?
Yeah, that's been one of the factors that lead to these boil water advisories is just the lack of capacity, the lack of trained personnel to run these water treatment plants in our communities. That's something that we've been advocating for the last at least the time I've been in this office, is for the feds to make these investments at the community level. You just don't build a $10 million water treatment plant and then walk away. You need to provide investments at the community level to be able to build that capacity for the community to run it in the long term.
But again, it does not seem beyond imagination that local people could go to whatever training facilities or community colleges or whatever in order to get the skills to run these facilities and repair them when they break down. You know, I guess I'm asking the same question again. Why has this been so problematic to fix? The solution seems available in plain sight.
Yeah, we need. It's been tried before, but it seems to be ad hoc, piecemeal, in terms of training programs. We just need to figure out a way to make it more sustainable, so that first of all, we eliminate all these BWAs and prevent our communities from getting back on this list in the future. So it has to be a long-term, sustainable process moving forward.
Okay, Willow, the people that you have talked to for your reporting for the Globe and Mail, whom do they blame for the situation?
Well, I'm just thinking of Neskantaga here in my recent conversations with Chief Chris Munias. In his, when not long after they were evacuated, he came up with a list of demands that would have to be met before he would let his community members return home safely. And one of those is an investigation into the business practices of like the contractors, engineers, and everyone else involved in these projects. I mean, these are huge multi-million-dollar projects, and while Indigenous services will say, you know, in terms of the boil water advisories, it's up to the First Nations to lift those, kind of, you know, giving it off to the First Nation. But they have, you know, requirements that need to be met. So when Chief Chris Munias calls for an investigation into the business practices of those who have you know, been involved in this project that's been delayed over years now and ongoing, that is needed. And I also think there's a barrier when it comes to the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy of the Department of Indigenous Services. And when we saw that in some of CBC's reporting, where Ann Stoughton has been replaced on the Neskantaga water file. So those are, you know, all things that need to be looked at for sure.
Chief Fiddler, I well remember Brian Mulroney, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada, once saying, "Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative." Can the current government of Canada say, compared to the alternatives, we've done pretty well at this? Do you think they can say that?
I don't know if I can answer that. You know, my response would be that this has been an issue for our communities for a long time, and it doesn't really matter which party forms government, provincially or federally. I think what we're saying is that we need to, you know, just we're always reaching out to government for help, for assistance, and I think what we're saying now is that you know, this has to be a collaborative approach in a long-term sustainable way, that we need to acknowledge you know, that you know, we've had these problems for a long time, and we need to you know, whether it's creating legislation, as I said, creating regulations, creating standards that will solve this problem in the longer term.
But you've got 97 long-term advisories that have been lifted. Does the federal Liberal government get any credit for that?
Well, I think it was last week I said that, you know, even though we seem to be making progress, for example, when I took this office 5 years ago, we had 34 boil water advisories in NAN. We're down to 14, and 14 still one too many. And, you know, I don't think we should be patting ourselves in the back until we eliminate that to zero.
Understood. Adrian, I'm going to ask you a bit of a strange question here, okay? Humor me for a second. I have no doubt that I have no doubt that Indigenous audiences understand the answer to this question, but non-Indigenous audiences may not. They may be wondering why, if you haven't been able to drink from your taps for 44 years, why don't you just leave? What's the answer to that?
That's a good question, actually. I get told that a lot, actually. Why don't you just get up and leave? Not only just from regular Canadians, but even from government officials. That's the attitude, or that's the question I get quite a bit, even in music industry. And my answer is I'm deep rooted here. This is my ancestral lands. This is where I grew up. This is where I raised my family, the Cree traditional way. And this is the only place where I feel at home in this entire country, and where I'm free to be who I am. This is one of the reasons why I choose to live here and continue to want to raise my family here.
That's the thing I wanted to get at. I think we need people to understand that the connection you feel to the land on which you have lived for generations and are raising your family and your grandchildren on, the connection you feel is more profound than even not being able to drink the water can force you away from. Have we got that right?
That's correct.
Okay, let's go on. We've got just a few minutes left here, and I guess I want to know, Chief Fiddler, they're not going to meet the March 2021 deadline. They've already established that. At what point in the future do you think it's possible for First Nations in this province to be able to drink water out of the tap everywhere?
Hopefully soon. I mean, that's still our priority, is to, at least in Treaty 9 and Treaty 5 in the territory. As I said, we have 14 communities on this list, and even though the community seems, or the government seems to be walking back on the commitment to eliminate boil water advisories in First Nations, we don't accept that. In fact, we've said that we should be doubling our efforts to eliminate all the communities from this list, especially while we're experiencing a global pandemic. And that's something we've been telling our communities over the last 9 months since this pandemic was declared in early March, that washing your hands and staying hydrated, drinking lots of water, disinfecting your home, and those are very difficult things to do if you don't have access to clean, safe drinking water. So we need to make sure that the work gets done to fix these water treatment plants and getting these communities off the list.
Well, that's a good point. When you are told to wash your hands in order to stave off COVID-19 and you've got contaminated water, what do people do?
Well, I think that's the question we're struggling with right now, and that's something that I hope the government of Canada hears. Leaders from Chief Munias and communities like Sandy Lake and Fort Hope and Musqueam, communities that have been on this list for a long time, that they need to hear what leaders are saying. They need to hear what children like Vidab and Munias are saying, that they need to listen to those voices and provide answers to the questions that they've been asking for a long time.
Jen Atkinson, you're trying to be part of the solution here. You know the size of the problem. How many years down the road are we looking at before every First Nations person in this province can drink water from their own tap safely?
I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact number of years. I know that it's absolutely unacceptable to have communities in Canada who can't drink their water. And I know that this challenge is going to take time, more time than we would all like. It needs money, training, education. We have to be able to work in consultation and collaboration with our partners. And another $1.5 billion sure wouldn't hurt.
Willow, what's your estimate of how long it's going to take to finally solve all this?
Given how the last 5 years have gone, I mean, I'm not. I don't know. I don't see it happening anytime soon, unless there's a major, political will, I guess, or will from those all those partners and players involved to really just quit messing around. And like Alvin says, you have to listen to the communities. You have to listen to the people on the ground there who know, who have the experience, who have the knowledge, and the solutions as well.
Adrian, you get the last 30 seconds. You think those grandkids of yours are ever going to be able to drink water out of the tap in Attawapiskat?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer because considering the history we've seen and the inactivity we've seen around these long-standing issues, it's very, very difficult for me to answer that question. But I certainly believe and hope that my grandkids will one day have safe drinking water coming from the taps, and I'd like to be part of that solution. You know, I've always said I'm willing to put my resources and thoughts and try to bring solutions to these issues, because as an Indigenous person, I think we're part of the solution in trying to figure out these long-standing water issues and all the other issues that exist in these communities.
Well, I know everybody watching this certainly hopes it happens sooner than later, and I want to thank all four of you: Adrian Sutherland, Chief Alvin Fiddler, Willow Fiddler, Jen Atkinson. It's good of all of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, December 7th, 2020. Students with special needs face special barriers to online learning. Tomorrow, we're looking at how well those young people are being served by the approaches to education available amid COVID-19. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.